The documentary Through the Night is perfectly timed for this moment when we're all thinking more deeply about caretakers. I speak with the director, Loira Limbal. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Loira Limbal has been active for many years behind the scenes at Firelight Media in Harlem. The founders of Firelight, Stanley Nelson and Marcia Smith, expanded from making their own films on Black history to start a documentary lab that mentors emerging filmmakers of color. In the past 12 years, over 120 filmmakers have gone through the lab, including previous guests on this podcast, Dawn Porter, Jatavia Gary, and Yoruba Richin. Loira was instrumental in the lab's growth. She held that full-time job on top of being a single mother. It meant putting her own filmmaking on hold for several years. Finally, she decided she couldn't put it off any longer. She called her production company Third Shift Media as she embarked on making Through the Night. The film looks at a 24-hour childcare business called Dee's Tots, run by Dolores and Patrick Hogan, out of their home in New Rochelle, a suburb of New York City. They cater to parents holding down jobs in roles like healthcare and food supply. We call these jobs essential, but the U.S. hasn't made it essential to provide them with childcare. Here's Dolores, also known as Nunu.
I have all different types of families in my daycare.
Hello, baby girl.
I have some that comes in at 6 o'clock in the morning that works to 8:30 at night. I have some that comes from 3:30 to 12:30 at night. I have some that comes in overnight. I see a lot of parents come in and break down. They don't want to do this, but they need to go out and work and pay their bills and take care of their family.
All right, I'll see you later. All right, baby, have a good day. Be careful.
This is the way the world is set up at this point.
That last line really stood out to me in 2020. This is the way the world is set up at this point. It reminds us that we could set up the world differently. Through the Night won a special jury prize at the Doc NYC Festival for paying attention, in the words of the jurors, to the ethics of care. I started by asking Loira how she first got interested in documentary film.
I was really young, actually. I was in my late teens, and I was a member of a youth organizing program in the South Bronx at The Point. And one of the activities that they did with us in that program was they would do movie nights. And so for a few weeks in a row, they screened Eyes on the Prize for us. And I remember watching, and taking in all of these stories and these images and feeling like, sort of having a huge aha moment, in terms of understanding why so many things were the way they were in my neighborhood, in my community, but things that up until that point, nobody had really ever stopped to explain to me, but as a young person, you're seeing things happen and you're questioning things, right? And you're thinking about your environment. And Eyes on the Prize was that moment, right, for me of understanding there's this history and this place. Because, you got to remember, my family is not from the United States, right? My family is from the Dominican Republic. My mother raised us not being fluent in English, so there was a lot about U.S. history that I didn't know and certainly was not taught in school. But, there were experiences of racism and violence that I was living through, as a Black person in New York City, but I had no real context. And having that experience, I remember thinking, I was 16 or 17, I was like, wow, this is what films can do. And I think that would probably be the earliest moment that I can recall of me being interested in documentary filmmaking. And after that moment, there were several others, but that's probably the earliest one.
The first documentary that Loira made is called Estilo Hip Hop. She worked with co-director V. Bravo to profile hip-hop artists in Brazil, Cuba, and Chile. It took them 8 years and was broadcast on PBS in 2009. As Loida was finishing that, she was looking for a job with more stability and health care. She heard about an opening with Stanley Nelson and Firelight Media.
Around that same time, a friend who had been working at Firelight mentioned, this place, Firelight, they're looking for an office manager. I know you're looking for work. They make documentary films. This might be a good fit. And, sure enough, I already knew Stanley's work. I had watched The Murder of Emmett Till, in Jonestown, I believe. So I was like, that would be amazing to work there because these are documentary filmmakers, right, that make really important work. And so I applied, I got the job, and that's, between Estilo Hip Hop and Through the Night, I've been at Firelight Media.
When you joined Firelight Media, it's a different organization than it is today. Can you talk about, what it was like when you joined and what were some of the pivotal experiences in its growth?
Yeah, sure. It was very, very different than it is today. When I joined, Marsha and Stanley the co-founders of Firelight, had just returned to New York after spending some time in California and having the organization based in the Bay Area. And Marsha had actually left to go back into the world of philanthropy. So when I got there, it was sort of Stanley was the only full-time staff member, and then me. And so, as such, we did all the things. We wore all the hats between the two of us, and we sort of joke that his father, Dr. Nelson, was like the third honorary member because we were in a small office in the front, of the first floor, and his dad was living in the back of the first floor. And so, we saw him every day, and it was like me, Stanley, and Dr. Nelson were the Firelight staff. And Orchid, Dr. Nelson's caretaker, who was an amazing person and had a very huge presence around the office in those days. Stanley at that time, when I joined, he was working on Freedom Riders. And so there was that one team in the office, and then Mabel Haddock, who is the founder of Black Public Media, had also just recently joined to run what was then called the Producers Lab and is now the Documentary Lab. And so that was the configuration, pretty much at that time, much smaller than we are today, both in terms of staff and in terms of programs. But also Stanley at that point was making one film at a time, which is no longer the case. He's making lots of films at one time now. Lots has changed in these last 11 years.
So over the course of those 11 years, you became really integral to, from my eyes anyways, to building out the Producers Lab and helping other filmmakers get their films made. And I wonder if you can talk about that experience and, what you were thinking about your own career. Here you are helping other filmmakers get their films made. The years are going by since your first film came out. How did that work?
Yeah, so many things there. I remember when Mabel, sort of transitioned out of the organization, and Marsha turned to me and said, well, you're going to have to do the Producers Lab now, And I kind of looked at her and I said, well, I can't really because, I've only made one film. It wasn't like some sort of huge smashing success. I mean, I like the film. I stand by it still today. I'm proud of it. But, I just felt like I didn't have any more experience than the fellows themselves. And so I felt very ill-equipped to sort of be leading that kind of program. But I stepped into it because I really believed in the work, and I myself knew the sort of the difference that good mentorship, sustained mentorship, could make, in the career and the filmmaking process of an emerging filmmaker. On Estilo Hip Hop, we were fortunate to have Phil Bertelsen as a mentor and also Sabine Hoffman. And their mentorship was like nothing short of critical. And so I had just come off of that experience myself, and I was like, well, I know what good sustained mentorship can do. So we'll just figure this out, And as we went along, I think it's one of the things that has become really integral to our work is just really listening. So we devise and design our programs just through listening to what folks are saying that they need or they want, and trying to remain nimble enough to be able to be responsive. And in terms of my own career, I certainly was thinking along the way, like, gosh, am I ever going to be able to make another film myself, In that time period, when I first started at Firelight, I was already married, right? Yes, I was married. I didn't have children. But over the course of the next few years, I had my first child, then I had my second child, then I got divorced. The work at Firelight was expanding. My role was increasing. My responsibility was increasing. So, it was like I have a more demanding job. I now have 2 young children. I am now divorced. I don't really think I'm ever going to make another film again because there's no time. And I remember sitting, at the retreats and listening to the presentations and things like that. And at one retreat, I kind of shared my desperate, conclusion that I was never going to be able to make another film with Maria Agui Carter, who was a presenter at this particular retreat. And she very kind of calmly looked at me and said, take a deep breath. She was like, you'll be able to make more films. It's just going to take you more time. As a mother, it's just going to take you more time, and your process and your path is going to look different than a lot of other people's paths look like, right? But you'll be able to make more films. I don't even know if she remembers that she said that to me, but it's something that I've held on to over these years. But it was, it was a real question for me, and a fear. I was very fearful that I wouldn't be able to make films again.
Well, I think there's a process when you're around a lot of other filmmakers and you see how hard the process is, and you see how hard people work and make films that don't turn out that well. They're working just as hard as the people who make films that do turn out well. And it can become, more intimidating. I mean, I know when I made my first film, the biggest asset I had was naivete. That I didn't know, what the obstacles were ahead of me. And that helped. And, after you do know what the obstacles are and you're constantly immersed in watching other people struggle, I think it's easy to internalize that. I mean, that can be something that holds you back.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that was part of it. I would even look at Stanley, and his teams and the way that they were working, and I'd say to myself, there's no way that I can carve out these kinds of hours to work on a film while parenting and working full time, and so definitely watching other people's process made me be like, yeah, I don't have the bandwidth, for all of this. And I think also for me, there was a part of it that I think I became very comfortable at advocating for other filmmakers, and that somehow that also started to me to feel like perhaps more important, than me pursuing my own work, because I just believe in the importance of it so much. And so I would sort of say to myself, you're not making films, but you're doing really meaningful work. This work is perhaps even more meaningful, than you trying to drive yourself crazy making another film, And also the experience working on my own film, my first film, it was hard. And I still had that I was processing, And so, there was like many reasons to think that I wasn't going to be able to, this is not for the faint of heart. Documentary filmmaking is not that.
So how did you overcome all those things and get started on Through the Night?
I think with Through the Night, when I first learned about the daycare in the film, it kind of gripped me in a way that was unshakable, because I think it just spoke so deeply to my own experiences, my mother's experiences of, working single mothers, working low-wage jobs, just this world that is literally my most immediate world. Reading that first article, it just kind of like took me down this very visceral trip down memory lane. It took me 2 years between reading the article and first learning about this particular daycare that's featured in the film. And then it would be 2 years later that I would finally reach out to the folks in the film.
I mean, that's interesting to me. I guess I wasn't sure how you first learned about Dolores and Patrick Hogan. In some ways, their experience, feels unique to them, and what a kind of loving, supportive atmosphere you've captured in the film. On the other hand, they must be one of thousands of daycare centers in the country, or even in the tri-state area, that if you wanted to make a film about daycare, that you could have chosen from. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, what it was about that particular place that made you focus there. Especially there are people doing daycare closer to your home in the Bronx. This is a place not too far, but not an urban setting.
Yeah, and this is a great question because I read the article and I reached out to one of the people who had worked on the piece because I knew her, and I asked if she would make an introduction, and she declined to do so. And then I sort of said, okay, well, I tried, and sort of let it go. But then I would still be thinking about this idea and how amazing it would be to make a film, about this community, this world, this universe. And I actually did talk to my own childcare provider to ask if she knew of providers who worked non-standard hours or who worked overnight hours and this sort of thing. And I think the piece about the overnight really caught me because my mother worked the overnight shift while she was raising us. And so I just remember there being like an added layer of challenges, with finding care with that type of schedule, and also like an added layer of stigma and judgment, around the idea that your children are being cared for by others through the night. And so that had really sort of stayed with me. And I did get names of other daycare centers, some in the Bronx, some in Harlem. I actually met with a few of them, but none of them spoke to me the way that the voices, that I kind of imagined in reading the article spoke to me. And part of the reason I think this particular daycare was the one that I was so intent on documenting was because in the article I noticed that there was a kind of a range of professions and socioeconomic backgrounds, right? That it's a very kind of diverse community in many different kinds of ways, right? Like in terms of family composition, racial and ethnic backgrounds, professions, right? All of these things, which for me felt important because one, that's what I know, communities of color to be like. Oftentimes people talk about like low income communities, and that it's like one picture that people have in their minds. But the reality is that there's a pretty broad, spectrum of people that live in the South Bronx, right? And I grew up with these folks. And so that was something that felt like a kind of a complexity and a sort of a layer that felt important for me. And then also because I sort of wanted to make the point with this film. I wanted to make sort of the point of how I'm trying to find like the right word, not just cruel, but just how the system that we have around work and care does not work for anyone. And so, yes, folks of color and low-income communities are certainly disproportionately impacted by these things, but at the end of the day, this doesn't work for anybody. And so I wanted there to be a diversity, right, of experiences in the film. So you have Shanona, who's a pediatric ER nurse, that is not a low-wage job, who is in the same community with Marisol, who is working 3 low-wage jobs, and that, again, that is very much the reality that I've known growing up in our communities. And so that was the thing, I think, that made these tots so special to me. And then once I got there and got to know them, then it's like Nuno and Patrick emerge as these amazing, charismatic, sort of perfect protagonists.
I wonder if I could ask you to pick a scene in the film that sort of embodies what you were trying to do in this film.
There's a scene where the children are getting ready to go to sleep, and they're sort of playing around, they're joking. Patrick is like, messing around with them, which he does all the time, like just joking, and he has them in stitches. They're like, dying of laughter.
I don't even know what you said. I don't even know what you just said. Telephone, Saved by the Bell.
And they're getting ready for bed, and they're, one of the mothers calls.
Hi, Mommy.
To check in and say goodnight, and what did you have for dinner, and this sort of thing. And they have the call, and then the children kind of get into a conversation with each other about their mother's schedules, and the debate becomes, do their mothers need sleep or not?
She needs to get some rest, though. Your mom got to get some rest because your mom be working at nighttime, and then she get off of work at the morning.
First, she drops me off at school. Then she takes Noah to school. Then she goes back. Sometimes she doesn't need to sleep. She doesn't need to rest if she don't feel like it.
While Nunu is sort of off camera cleaning something, and she overhears one of the little girls asking her mother about, shortness of breath, and she knows that this little girl has asthma. She's off camera. She's like totally doing something else, but she's ever mindful of everything that's happening with her peripheral vision. And she herself is like achy, but then asking the little girl to go check if she has her asthma pump in her bag overnight, and just the sort of that scene for me really encapsulated all the layers of this community, right? It's the mom who is parenting off-site because she is parenting, right? She is calling to check in, and she's having a conversation with her daughter about what shortness of breath means, right? This is parenting that's happening just in a different way. The babies are happy, they're, joking, but they're also in community and conversation with each other. Nunu is mindful and catching things that she doesn't even have her full eye on, but still, kind of able to catch it. And then, the kind of the night they get tucked in, and, the night settles down. And it's just all these kind of layers, right? And all the different players of this ecosystem, which is, I think, what we were trying to do with the film. We talked a lot. Malika Zuhali Waral, our editor, and Osei Ased, our composer, we ended up kind of creating this sort of triangle metaphor to identify what the tone and the mood of each cue should be for different scenes. And what we realized in doing that was that every scene had sort of at least 3 different emotions or tones or moods, right, that we were trying to evoke that were often in tension with each other, right? So there's like love and tenderness, but there's nostalgia, there's some sadness, right? Or there's joy, but there's also some exhaustion and defeat, or, you know, any number of things, right? And that every scene, you know, we were trying to make sure had that kind of complexity of, or that those layers, so that nothing is ever just fully, you know, triumphant, but also nothing is ever just like a sob story. It's like the complexity of the everyday, you know, as working parents, right, and as working people. And I think that really does encapsulate a lot of what I was trying to do with the film. Was to pack all that stuff in, but still somehow be subtle about it. That was also the goal.
Yeah. I mean, I think a strength of the film is its subtlety and, you know, in a way, kind of like slowing us down to pay attention to the kind of details that you just described. It's there aren't, you know, big dramatic, you know, plot lines going on. It's not like they're going to close down the childcare, you know, will they make it kind of action. You must be conscious of, as someone who works with a lot of filmmakers, about the, you know, the general tendencies that, you know, that even sometimes the documentary marketplace is, you know, pushing people to towards. I wonder if you felt like you were consciously resisting that.
Yes, we were very conscious of it, you know, and there was, again, a manifesto of sorts that we wanted to make without making it, which is around the idea that our lives as people of color are worthy of just a slow and patient and curious gaze and lens that is looking at just the everyday, to sort of stand in opposition to this other track of, you know, thinking and conversations in the U.S. where many documentary films about communities of color are about the many violences that we experience, you know, and which are, it's important, right? Those stories are important. I'm certainly not saying that they are not, but I think when you have a kind of a canon that is really lopsided with those kinds of stories and nothing to balance, or very little, I should say, to balance it out, that further contributes, you know, to the dehumanization, right? That we all become conditioned to only being able to see Black and brown bodies in certain ways. And so just kind of sitting, right, that what you said, like wanting to slow everyone down enough to just kind of sit and watch children playing, you know, a hand clapping game, or to watch Nunu wiping down a counter, or, you know, to watch one little kid tie another kid's shoelaces. Like, this is everyday life. And again, we face a lot of oppression, but we are also living our lives. And I think it's important for us and for everyone to see us living, right? And so that was something that we were really conscious about. I will say I was worried that, you know, as I increasingly felt myself leaning towards something that was very kind of subtle and understated in some ways, I was worried that in the marketplace, it wouldn't be legible, or it wouldn't like register for anyone, because it's not splashy. It's not, you know, there aren't the super dramatic plot twists and turns, you know. It is meditative and, you know, just kind of patient, right? Which isn't necessarily how I would characterize American culture, overall.
Yeah.
So I was worried. If I'm honest, about whether the film would register really for anyone, if there was really a place in any given cycle of releases for a film like this. But we would have those conversations, and that would just almost make us like more interested in doing that, and just being like, well, it'll land for whoever it lands with, but this is really what especially Malika and I, who worked together from the very first shoot. So Malika and I were together the whole 4 years of making the film. The more we talked about it and we kind of shared our concerns, the more that we became like convinced that this was what we wanted to do.
I heard you talk in another interview about the way that you brought a kind of practice of mothering into the filmmaking process. I wonder if you can talk about the way you and Malika and your other team members nurtured this film the way caretakers nurture.
Yeah, I think that probably was one of the biggest epiphanies that I had while working on this film. I went into the film very concerned and apprehensive about like striking a balance between parenting, working full time, and making a film, right? So I was scared, honestly, very scared, and really scared of failing, scared of squandering people's goodwill, squandering relationships, and the only framework that I had, and I think this is part of the reason that I was so scared for motherhood, and as it relates to having an artistic or a creative practice, was the framework that tells you that once you have kids, like, you kind of can't have a creative practice. Like that was in my head, right? Like, although I know women who certainly have our mothers or whatever, that framework is very prevalent in our society, and I think I had really internalized it, and so I was very worried about like going up against that, and failing. And the epiphany for me, and I've had many, but one of the biggest ones was that, like, actually I realized there was a really sort of symbiotic relationship between, for me, the muscles that I use in my everyday mothering, right? Particularly around like listening, around communicating, around intention, right? Around power dynamics, that like when I was in a good flow at home, I could literally translate those same muscles over to the creative process into production. Which I think there is a way in which children, like, what they want from you or what they need from you is you in your sort of plainest, most authentic way. Like, they want you, your presence, your full presence, with whatever flaws or whatever you have. If you're their parent, that's what they want. And I think that for me, the creative process, that's what it wants of me too, is me. With all my stuff, but for me to show up sort of fully present, and so there was just this symbiosis, that I saw happening, and sometimes vice versa, that something, if I had some sort of breakthrough, or I strengthened a muscle on a shoot, I could then somehow bring that home, and it could apply in the midst of the next like argument that I was having with my 8-year-old about whatever it was, and that ultimately, like, realizing, like, yes, I maybe didn't get the balance right all the time, I'm sure, but that I am enough for my children. I am actually like what my children need most, and I'm enough. And I was enough for this film, you know? And so I think that's like one of the biggest sorts of epiphanies that I hope serves me moving forward, because I certainly want to make more films. And I think it's one that I think it's important to share, because I do think that so many mothers do battle with this question of how to pursue their passions in light of their responsibilities, right?
I want to thank Loira Limbal for speaking with me. Her new film, Through the Night, has been playing in virtual cinemas and is qualified for the Oscars. It will be broadcast on the POV series next spring. We'll be back with more Pure Nonfiction in the new year. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. You can read our show notes and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.